Aiden Calloway stepped onto the creaky wooden porch of the small cabin he now called home, inhaling the crisp morning air. It was a far cry from the penthouses, designer suits, and high-stakes business deals that once defined his life, but he didn't regret leaving it all behind. Not for a second. For years, he had built an empire, millions in investments, a name that commanded respect in boardrooms across the country. But the glitz and endless pursuit of wealth had left him cold. So one day, Aiden walked away. He traded tailored suits for flannel shirts, stock market reports for the sound of birds in the trees, and luxury for simplicity. The town of Willow Creek was the perfect place to disappear. A quiet, picturesque town nestled between mountains and sprawling fields, where no one cared about his last name or his fortune. Here he was just Aiden, the man who fixed things, helped around town, and kept mostly to himself. That morning, he had barely stepped off his porch when he heard a frustrated sigh coming from the road. A woman stood beside an old, beaten-up truck, staring at the smoking hood like it had personally offended her. "Come on, you piece of junk," she muttered, kicking the tire. Aiden chuckled under his breath and made his way over. "Need a hand?" The woman turned, brushing dark curls from her face, her brown eyes filled with a mix of determination and exasperation. She was beautiful in a way that caught him off guard, raw and unpolished, like someone who didn't have time to worry about impressing anyone. "Unless you can magically make this thing run, I'm not sure it'll help," she said, placing her hands on her hips. Aiden crouched down, lifting the hood. "I can take a look. Name's Aiden." She hesitated before answering. "Penelope, but everyone calls me Penny." Penny. It suited her strong, no-nonsense, but with a warmth beneath the surface. "You live around here?" He asked, inspecting the engine. "Just moved back. My grandmother's farm," she said, leaning against the truck. "She passed a few months ago, and I'm trying to keep it running." Aiden glanced at her, seeing the weight of responsibility in her eyes. "That's a lot to take on alone," she shrugged. "I don't have much of a choice. It's home." He nodded, understanding more than he let on. He had once carried the weight of an entire empire on his shoulders, and it had nearly crushed him. After a few minutes of tinkering, he wiped his hands on a rag from his pocket. "You've got a busted radiator. I can fix it, but it'll take a day or two to get the part." Penny sighed, pushing her curls back again. "Just my luck." "I can give you a ride into town if you need anything," Aiden offered. She studied him, as if trying to decide whether to trust him. Eventually, she nodded. "I could use some supplies." As they drove into town, Penny stole a glance at him. "So, Aiden, what's your story?" "You don't look like someone who spent his whole life in Willow Creek." He smiled slightly, keeping his eyes on the road. "Let's just say I left my old life behind for something quieter." She raised a brow. "You some kind of outlaw?" He let out a short laugh. "Nothing that exciting, just needed a change." Penny didn't press, which he appreciated. Most people would have pried, but she seemed content with whatever version of the truth he wanted to give. When they reached the supply store, she hopped out and disappeared inside. Aiden leaned against his truck, watching her through the window, the way she moved with quiet confidence. There was something about her, something that made him feel more alive than he had in years. And that was dangerous. He had left his old life for peace, for solitude. He hadn't planned on getting tangled up with someone, especially not someone like Penny, someone who made him want things he had no business wanting. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Aiden watched as Penny emerged from the supply store, her arms full of items she clearly hadn't planned on buying. A bag of flour balanced precariously on top of a bundle of canned goods, nearly toppling as she shifted the weight. Without a word, he stepped forward, plucking the flour from the pile before it slipped. She exhaled, giving him a look of gratitude. "Didn't think this through," she admitted. Aiden chuckled, loading the items into the truck bed. "Seems like you've got a lot on your plate." Penny leaned against the passenger door and crossed her arms. You could say that. The farm's a mess, the crops are struggling, and the bills don't stop coming, but I'll figure it out. There was no self-pity in her tone, only determination. Aiden respected that. It reminded him of the way he had once tackled obstacles head-on, refusing to back down. He climbed into the driver's seat, waiting for Penny to settle in before pulling back onto the road. The ride was quiet for a while, the landscape rolling past in golden hues of late afternoon sun. Then Penny spoke. What made you leave your old life behind? Aiden kept his eyes on the road, considering his answer. He wasn't ready to reveal everything, not yet. I needed something real, he finally said. Something that didn't feel like I was constantly chasing the next thing. Penny studied him, as if weighing his words. And you found that here. Aiden exhaled, gripping the wheel a little tighter. I'm still figuring it out. She nodded, as if she understood exactly what he meant. When they reached her farm, Aiden hopped out first, grabbing some of the bags from the truck bed before Penny could insist she had it handled. She led the way to the house, the front porch sagging slightly under their weight. Inside, the place felt lived in but worn, as if it had been full of life once but had since quieted. Photographs lined the mantel, faded with time. The kitchen had the scent of freshly baked bread, though Penny made no mention of cooking. She set her bags down on the counter. You want some coffee? It's the least I can do after you saved me from being stranded. Aiden hesitated. He hadn't planned on staying long, but something about the place, or maybe just Penny, made him linger. Sure. She moved around the kitchen with practiced ease, filling the pot and setting it to brew. So you fix cars in your spare time? Aiden leaned against the counter. I fix a lot of things. People in town know I can handle repairs, so they come to me when they need help. Penny handed him a mug. Sounds like you've made yourself useful. He took a sip, the warmth spreading through him. It's a change from what I used to do. She tilted her head. What was that exactly? Aiden considered his words carefully. Let's just say I used to be in a world where everything moved too fast, where people only cared about what they could get from you. Penny's expression didn't change, but there was something in her eyes and understanding. Sounds exhausting. It was. She leaned against the counter beside him, her shoulder nearly brushing his. I get it, trying to hold onto something real. That's why I came back. My grandmother's farm was the only place that ever felt like home. Aiden glanced at her, seeing the quiet strength in her features. And now it's yours to keep running, she nodded. And I will, no matter what it takes. Aiden admired that. He had spent so much of his life surrounded by people who would rather throw money at their problems than face them head-on. Penny wasn't like that. She was fighting for something that mattered to her. Before he could stop himself, he said, I could help if you need it. Penny arched a brow. You offering to fix more than just my truck, Aiden shrugged. I know my way around repairs. And farms need a lot of fixing. She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to determine if he was serious. Then, slowly, she nodded. All right, but don't think I won't put you to work. Aiden smiled. I'd expect nothing less. As the evening settled in, Aiden found himself unwilling to leave just yet. Penny led him outside, where the barn stood in the fading light, its roof sagging in places. This is the biggest problem, she admitted, gesturing to the structure. If I don't fix it soon, it'll collapse completely. Aiden ran a hand over the worn wood, assessing the damage. It's not impossible, just needs time and the right materials. Time is the problem, Penny muttered. Aiden turned to her. Then let's start tomorrow. Penny blinked. You're serious? Yeah, I don't have anywhere else to be. For the first time since he met her, Penny's expression softened into something that wasn't guarded determination. It was gratitude. All right, she said. Tomorrow. As Aiden walked back to his truck, he realized something strange helping Penny felt right. It wasn't about business deals or profit margins. It was about something real. And for the first time in a long time, he wanted to stay. The morning air was crisp as Aiden pulled his truck up to Penny's farm, the sky a soft shade of blue streaked with early sunlight. He stepped out, stretching his shoulders as he took in the land before him. The barn sat in the distance, its structure leaning slightly, a testament to years of wear and neglect. Penny was already outside, rolling up the sleeves of her faded flannel shirt as she surveyed the damage. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, brushing a loose curl from her face. "Didn't think you'd actually show," she said, arching a brow. Aiden crossed his arms. "Told you I would." She studied him for a brief moment, as if assessing whether he was truly up for the task, then nodded toward the barn. "Well, if you're serious, let's get to work." They spent the next several hours assessing the damage, pulling away broken boards and reinforcing the weaker beams. Aiden worked in silence, his focus entirely on the task at hand. Penny, on the other hand, never hesitated to fill the quiet with small observations about the farm, memories of her grandmother, or the long list of things still needing to be done. It wasn't idle chatter. There was meaning in every word, a weight behind the way she spoke about the land. This place wasn't just a farm to her, it was a legacy, something she refused to let slip through her fingers. At midday, Penny wiped her brow with the back of her hand and exhaled. "I think this is the hardest I've worked in weeks." Aiden leaned against a nearby workbench, taking a sip from his water bottle. "Feels good to fix something with your hands." She eyed him curiously. "You talk like you've done this before." Aiden hesitated. He had spent years making deals, signing contracts, and managing wealth, but the kind of work he was doing now, the kind that left his muscles sore and his hands covered in dust, felt more satisfying than anything he had accomplished in boardrooms. His past was something he had walked away from, but Penny was starting to pull pieces of it back to the surface, unintentionally forcing him to confront what he had left behind. "I used to take things apart when I was a kid," he admitted. "Figured if I could understand how something worked, I could figure out how to fix it." Penny tilted her head. "And now you help rebuild barns." Something like that. She didn't press, which he appreciated. Instead, she tossed him a hammer and gestured toward the next section of the structure. "Well, since you're so good at fixing things, let's see what you can do with this mess." They worked through the afternoon, the rhythm of their movements falling into an unspoken sync. Penny was stubborn. She insisted on doing as much as she could herself, but Aiden could see when fatigue started to creep in. When she tried to lift a particularly heavy beam on her own, he stepped in without a word, steadying it before she could protest. Their fingers brushed for the briefest moment, sending an unexpected jolt through him. Penny pulled back quickly, clearing her throat. "Thanks." Aiden nodded, but his mind lingered on the way that small touch had stirred something deep inside him. By the time the sun started to dip toward the horizon, the barn was beginning to look more stable. It was far from finished, but the progress they had made was undeniable. Penny stepped back, hands on her hips, surveying their work. Not bad for a day's effort. "You doubted me," Aiden said, leaning against the ladder he had just climbed down from. She gave him a sideways glance. "I don't know you well enough to trust you just yet." The honesty in her words struck him. She wasn't the kind of person who gave her trust easily, and he respected that. "Fair enough," he said. "Guess I'll just have to keep showing up." Penny didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned toward the house. "You hungry? I was gonna throw something together for dinner." Aiden hesitated. Staying meant opening another door, one that would make it harder to keep the distance he had been trying to maintain. But as he glanced at Penny, the way she stood there, waiting for his answer without expectation, he realized he didn't want to leave just yet. He nodded. "Yeah, I could eat." Inside, the kitchen was warm, the scent of something savory filling the air. Penny moved around with ease, chopping vegetables and stirring a pot on the stove. Aiden leaned against the counter, watching as she worked. "You do this every night?" he asked. She shrugged. "Cooking keeps me sane. It's one of the few things in my control." Aiden understood that feeling all too well. Years of power and influence had never given him the kind of control he had wanted over his own life. Now here he was, sitting in a quiet kitchen, feeling more at peace than he had in years. "Must be nice," he said, watching as she plated the food. She set a dish in front of him and smirked. "If you say so, just don't complain if it's terrible." Aiden took a bite and shook his head. "You undersell yourself." Penny rolled her eyes but didn't argue. As they ate, conversation flowed naturally. Penny talked about the challenges of running the farm, the small victories that kept her going. Aiden listened, offering occasional insights but mostly just letting her speak. It wasn't until the plates were empty and the kitchen had settled into a comfortable quiet that Penny finally turned to him with a question he hadn't been expecting. "Do you ever miss it?" She asked. Aiden tensed slightly. "Miss what?" "Whatever life you left behind," he considered his answer carefully. There were parts he missed. Sure, the ease of solving problems with money, the certainty of always knowing his next move. But there was also the loneliness, the constant pressure, the feeling that no matter how much he achieved, it was never enough. "No," he finally said. "Not really." Penny studied him for a moment, then nodded as if she understood. And in that moment, Aiden realized something unsettling. He wasn't just helping Penny rebuild her farm. He was rebuilding himself, too. Days turned into weeks, and Aiden found himself returning to Penny's farm every morning without hesitation. The barn repairs had started as an excuse, a way to help, to do something tangible. But now, it had become something else entirely, something that tethered him to this place in a way he hadn't expected. He had spent years running from attachments, from anything that could compromise the quiet solitude he had carved out for himself. Yet Penny had worked her way into his life without even trying, and now he couldn't imagine leaving. The barn was nearly complete, its structure stronger than it had been in years. The once collapsing walls now stood firm, the roof reinforced and secure. It was more than just a building. It was evidence of what they had built together, not just in beams and nails, but in trust. One evening, as the last light of the sun stretched across the fields, Aiden found Penny leaning against the fence, her gaze lost in the horizon. He approached quietly, standing beside her without speaking. For a while, neither of them said anything. The cicadas hummed in the distance, and the air was heavy with the scent of earth and hay. Penny's hands rested on the worn wood of the fence, her fingers tracing patterns absently. Then, finally, she spoke. "I never thought I'd have help with any of this," she admitted. "I thought it was all on me." Aiden glanced at her, watching the way her expression softened in the fading light. "You don't have to do it alone." She turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his, searching for something unspoken. "I don't know how to let people help me." Aiden understood that feeling better than he cared to admit. He had once built walls so high around himself that no one could reach him. But Penny had cracked through them with nothing more than her quiet resilience, her unwavering determination to keep moving forward despite everything. "You let me in," he said, his voice lower now. "Even if you didn't mean to." She exhaled, something shifting between them in the quiet space of the evening. The air felt different, charged with something that neither of them had dared name before. And then, as if drawn by an invisible force, Penny turned fully toward him. Aiden didn't move, didn't breathe, afraid that if he so much as blinked, he might break whatever spell had settled over them. But then she reached for him, her fingers hesitating just before touching his. Aiden closed the distance, his hand covering hers, grounding them both in the moment. It was the simplest touch, and yet it set fire to everything inside him. Penny's voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know what this is." Aiden held her gaze, his thumb brushing against her skin, something worth holding on to. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in, her forehead nearly touching his. He could feel her breath, warm and uncertain, and it was in that moment that Aiden realized he had been waiting for this, for something real, something that made all the years of chasing empty things seem meaningless. When he finally closed the distance, when his lips met hers, it wasn't hurried or desperate. It was deliberate, a slow unraveling of everything he had kept locked away. Penny responded in kind, her fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt as if anchoring herself to him. The kiss was a promise, unspoken but understood. When they finally pulled apart, Penny let out a shaky breath. Aiden rested his forehead against hers, unwilling to break the closeness just yet. She laughed softly, almost disbelieving. "I didn't see this coming." "Neither did I," Aiden admitted, but now that it had happened, there was no going back. The next morning, nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Aiden arrived at the farm as usual, but this time, Penny was waiting for him on the porch, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. She handed him one without a word, their fingers brushing in the exchange. They sat side by side on the porch steps, watching the sun rise over the fields. "Are you staying?" she finally asked, her voice careful, as if afraid of the answer. Aiden turned to her, taking in the way the early light caught in her hair, the way she looked at him like she was trying to figure out if she could trust him. He reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, and for the first time in years he meant it. The days that followed were different, yet neither of them said it outright. Penny didn't ask Aiden to stay, but she didn't have to. He was there every morning, rolling up his sleeves, tackling whatever needed fixing without question. It was in the way she set out an extra coffee cup without thinking, the way she glanced toward the road when she expected him to show up. Aiden had spent his life surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Investors who saw him as a means to an end, associates who measured his worth by the deals he could close. But here, with Penny, there was no agenda. No pretense. She had let him in, not because of what he could offer, but because of who he was when everything else had been stripped away. One afternoon, as they stood side by side in the barn, reinforcing the last of the beams, Penny wiped her hands on her jeans and exhaled. The structure was solid now, no longer on the verge of collapse. It was a victory, but it also meant there was nothing left to fix, at least, not the kind of thing that needed hammers and nails. Penny crossed her arms, looking at him with something unreadable in her expression. "So what now?" Aiden leaned against the freshly repaired wall, considering her words. He could feel the weight of the question, the unspoken uncertainty in the air. This had started as a simple offer to help, but now they had built something more than just a barn. "You tell me," he said, his voice steady. Penny let out a breath, her fingers tapping against her arm as if she were gathering her thoughts. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "Letting someone in like this, it's new." Aiden understood. He had spent years avoiding connection, keeping people at a distance because it was easier than risking disappointment. But Penny had walked into his life and broken down every wall he had built without even trying. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, the words coming easily now. She studied him, searching for any sign that he might backtrack, that he might decide this life wasn't enough. But Aiden had already made his choice, and for the first time in years, he wasn't second-guessing it. That evening, Penny invited him inside without hesitation. They cooked together, moving around the kitchen as if they had been doing it for years instead of weeks. It was comfortable, easy in a way Aiden hadn't known he needed. He caught himself watching her when she wasn't looking, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear absent-mindedly, the small furrow in her brow when she concentrated. He had spent his life surrounded by extravagance, by people draped in designer clothes and diamonds, yet nothing had ever held his attention the way Penny did. After dinner, they stepped outside onto the porch, the night air cool against their skin. The stars stretched above them, uninterrupted by city lights, and for the first time in years, Aiden felt grounded. Penny leaned against the railing, staring out at the fields. "I used to dream about leaving this place," she said, her voice quiet. "Thought maybe I'd find something bigger, something more." Aiden tilted his head, watching her. "And now," she exhaled, a small smile playing at the corner of her lips. "Now I think I was looking for the wrong thing." He knew exactly what she meant. He had spent years chasing success, convinced that if he built enough, earned enough, he would finally feel whole. But standing there with Penny beside him, he realized that the life he had walked away from wasn't what he had needed at all. He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, she squeezed his hand lightly, as if confirming that whatever this was, they were in it together. Time passed in a way that felt natural, effortless. Aiden found himself more involved in the farm, not because he had to be, but because he wanted to be. He learned the rhythm of Penny's days, the way she woke before the sun, the quiet satisfaction she got from seeing things grow. And Penny, for all her initial hesitation, let him in more and more each day. She started asking for his opinion on things, trusting him in ways that went beyond just fixing broken fences and repairing roofs. One evening, as they sat on the porch after another long day, Penny turned to him, her gaze serious. "Do you ever think about going back?" Aiden didn't hesitate. "No," she nodded, as if she had already known the answer but needed to hear it anyway. "Good." And that was it. No grand declaration, no need for further explanation. Just an understanding that this, whatever they had built, was real. Aiden had spent his life believing that love was something complicated, something tangled up in expectations and conditions. But with Penny, it wasn't complicated at all. It was just right. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of earth and hay as Aiden walked across the field, his boots pressing into the damp soil. The farm had transformed in the weeks since he first arrived. The barn, once on the verge of collapse, now stood strong against the horizon, its fresh wooden beams sturdy and resilient. The fields, once struggling, had begun to thrive under Penny's relentless dedication. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, Aiden had found something he hadn't even realized he was searching for. Penny stood by the fence, her back to him, watching the horses graze in the pasture. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over her, catching in the strands of her dark hair as the wind lifted them. She was lost in thought, her fingers tapping absently against the wooden post. Aiden didn't announce his presence. He simply walked up beside her, letting the quiet settle between them. Penny glanced at him briefly before turning her attention back to the open fields. "I got a call today," she said after a moment, her voice unreadable. Aiden waited, sensing there was more. "It was from a buyer," she continued. "Someone who wants to purchase the farm." The words hit harder than he expected. He turned to face her fully, searching her expression. "And," she exhaled, still staring at the horizon, "it would be enough to walk away, start over somewhere else." Aiden's chest tightened. He had known from the beginning that Penny had once dreamed of leaving this place. Had the time they spent together changed that? Or had he just been fooling himself into thinking she wanted to stay? "And what do you want?" he asked, his voice careful. Penny turned to him then, her brown eyes locking onto his. "I don't know," she admitted. "For the first time in my life, I don't have a clear answer." Aiden studied her, reading the uncertainty in her features. He knew what it was like to stand at a crossroads, to feel the weight of a decision pressing down. He had made his choice when he left his old life behind, but Penny's choice wasn't just about geography. It was about what she wanted her future to look like, so he didn't push. He didn't try to convince her of anything. Instead, he leaned against the fence, mirroring her stance, and said, "Then let's figure it out." Penny let out a small breath, something easing in her posture. "I don't want to lose everything my grandmother built, but I also don't want to feel trapped by it." Aiden nodded. "You don't have to do either. You can make this place yours on your terms." She was quiet for a long moment before finally whispering, "And you," he turned to her, his expression steady. "I already made my choice. I'm here." A flicker of emotion crossed her face, something unguarded and raw. She swallowed, looking away briefly before meeting his gaze again. "You could go anywhere, do anything. Why stay?" Aiden reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers before lacing them together. "Because this is where I want to be." The wind rustled through the fields, carrying the weight of the moment between them. Penny squeezed his hand, her grip firm, certain. "I don't want to sell," she said finally, "but I don't want to do this alone either." Aiden felt something settle inside him, solid and unshakable. "You won't have to." That evening they sat on the porch, the stars stretching across the sky above them. Penny leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, her body warm against his. For the first time in years, Aiden wasn't thinking about what came next. He wasn't planning his next move or strategizing his next step. He was simply here in this moment with the woman who had become his home. Penny shifted slightly, tilting her head to look at him. "You really mean it, don't you?" Aiden turned to her, his hand finding hers again. "I've never been more sure of anything." A slow smile spread across her face, one that reached her eyes, full of something deep and unwavering. And as she pulled him into a kiss, soft and lingering beneath the vast country sky, Aiden knew without a doubt that he had found exactly what he had been searching for all along. A place to belong. A love worth staying for, and a future finally worth holding on to.